Hey everybody, it's Friday, February the 16th, 2024, and welcome to How to Restart a Church, the weekly show where I, Pastor Trey Comstock, and my dear friend and colleague, Pastor Emily Larson, explore what it means to make church happen or make church happen again. This week, we are absolutely blessed to be joined by an amazingly talented writer and kind of thought leader into church leadership, Tod Bolsinger. He wrote what I think of as one of the books on church leadership called Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. I certainly had to read it in the leadership program that I was a part of, and most folks I know have interacted with that or many of his others' books. And so, Tod, you have done so much. My introduction is rather poor, and so tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into this work of helping us understand how to lead churches.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be with you. So, the most important way that I got into this was by being a pastor myself. So, for 27 years, I was a pastor, 10 years as an associate in a large, kind of iconic downtown church that at one time at its height had been the largest church in the denomination that I served, the Presbyterian Church USA.
Jeez.
It had about 9,000 members back in the 60s. And when I got there in the 80s, it had about 4,000. And today it probably has about 300 or 400. And that's not because of me entirely, but I was part of the years where I saw some of the change. And then for 17 years, I was a pastor in a church in San Clemente, California, where I was the lead pastor there for 17 years. And through all of the process of watching what it's like to go through change, I had to learn a lot about change and leading a congregation that was trying hard to be faithful in the midst of change. I had to learn how to be a person who could do leadership in the midst of change. And I ended up applying my PhD work to change leadership and that's now what I do every single day. So today, my entire world is about helping faith leaders thrive as change leaders. I teach that subject alone today now in the Doctor of Ministry program at the seminary that I serve. And I have a consulting firm, AE Sloan Leadership, that does that every day. So that's what I do. Every day I wake up and I work with some faith leader who's trying to navigate change.
You talk about this, Simon Canoeing the Mountains. That's a lot of us, right? I like the pitch on that book is, you follow the journey of Lewis and Clark as a frame device to talk about changing church. But, you make the really salient point that there was a world that we, the capital C church, expected to exist, and I guess expected to exist forever. And then that forever didn't turn out to be forever. And so now so many of us find ourselves in utterly uncharted waters of, how do you adapt the capital C church or an individual church to a world that they simply were not constructed for.
Right. Yeah. So if you think about it this way, for the better part of 1,700 years, the dominant worldview in the Western world was what's called Christendom. And what Christendom means isn't that everybody is a Christian. It's that Christianity has privilege. Christianity has a home field advantage. It's like if the Super Bowl was played in your home field, the most important game, and you got to have all the fans and everybody cheering you on and slept in your own bed and everything was to your advantage, it would be a big advantage. And so what for 1,700 years, Christianity was at the center of culture and supported by culture. And that began to change about 40 or 50 years ago, that began to change. But most of the church tried to work really hard just to hold on to Christendom instead of making the transition into this new post-Christendom world where we live in a more pluralistic world where Christianity is one voice among many, and where some places it doesn't feel like you have a home field advantage at all. So it depends on where you are in the country and whatnot. And what the hard part is if you're trained to assume that every game is a home game
Right.
and that you're always supposed to have the advantage, and all of a sudden the world changes, it's a pretty dramatic change. And that's where most of us have found ourselves. And then, of course, we had this thing called the pandemic.
Oh, yes.
At least I live in California. We had it here in the I'm not sure
Emily and I
every
served
place in the country,
a
but we
rural
had it here,
congregation
so.
during the pandemic. We often had to play the role of reminding folks of the existence of said pandemic. But yeah, no, even in, rural East Texas, it hit us.
Yes. And now I'm really curious because you released a book during 2020, during the pandemic. Was that book written before, during, or, was that written in response to the pandemic, or was that book already written when COVID started to hit? Really?
Wow.
The book was already written. Yeah. Yeah. So Emily, so the book is called Tempered Resilience: How Leaders Are Formed in the Crucible of Change. And it was really about the way in which the big challenge of leading change wasn't the changing world, as hard as that is.
Yeah.
It was the resistance of your own people when you start making changes to be faithful in a changing world. And what we started realizing is the most soul-sucking thing for most leaders isn't the resistance of the world out there. It's the resistance and sometimes the flat-out sabotage we get from our own people within our own congregations and our own companies. And so I wrote that. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and every pastor I know basically experienced that sense. So, that was a good time.
I've met the text of Matthew 10:36 on my office wall, which reads, "One's foes shall be members of one's own household," and that is, I use it in part as a device to see who's zoning out in meetings. Regular listeners to the show have heard about this before, but some of it you're right, it's 100% true. Of often the challenge isn't the world outside our box. It is the phrase, well, we've always, right? Well, we've always done X. Well, we've always done Y.
But that's the way we've always done it.
And that has certainly, in my own lived experience of trying to lead churches to do something different, it is often that, well, yeah, that sounds really great, Pastor, but we've always done fill in the blank. And so I guess what is, from your research, from your kind of really intense work with so many congregations and pastors seeking to do change, what are the ways you see that we should overcome that, right? Which you're 100% right, that as the resistance is often inside our walls, how do we, as church leaders or as folks interested in doing church differently, help folks overcome their kind of natural reticence to change?
Well, so the first thing we have to do is recognize a couple of things about that. First of all, people's resistance to change is not about them being stubborn or faithless.
Yeah.
It's about the fact that they are facing loss. So one of the famous phrases from Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky, who are the kind of the thought leaders behind this kind of leadership that's called adaptive change, is that people don't resist change, they resist loss. And so the first thing we have to do when we get to resistance is recognize people aren't resisting us because they're bad people, they're anxious people. Even the book Tempered Resilience is all about responding to sabotage, which is when people so resist you, they want to stop the very thing they've asked you to do. So people will oftentimes invite you, please come as a young pastor and help us reach the next generation that is walking away from the church. And you start actually doing that, and they go, but don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. And when that happens, what we have a tendency to do is say, oh, these are bad people. These are people who really don't understand the gospel. They don't really understand the mission. They really don't. And what we realize is sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do. It is the human things that anxious people do. And then people get anxious, they sabotage because the status quo is familiar. And we really are programmed almost like biologically to seek the familiar. And it's really hard to actually have to form people to overcome their reaction to the unfamiliar, to the uncharted territory.
That's been a lot of our conversations here at this church, because we've got, we are blessed that we have some folks that, remember when this building went up in, 1961. And can really, with deep passion, tell the story of the time the church was the fullest was the Sunday after the JFK assassination in 1963, and just what it meant to be a part of that moment. And so, and we talked about, do we leave this spot because we're in an urban environment where I pay $100,000 a year in insurance, which is not interesting, but is a financial problem. And that didn't make sense for a lot of reasons. But then a lot of our conversation has even just been about, what does it mean if the physical building that we are in, that was built to be the coolest thing in Methodism circa 1961, what does it mean if this building goes away? And that's been a lot of our processing is, it is for some of our folks, they've been in this building either their whole lives or their entire adult lives.
One of the challenges for so many of us is if the entire intention is to help people have a life-transforming encounter with God, that will literally rearrange your life. That's what repentance is about. You really reorient your life because of the good news of God's love and God's redeeming and reconciling purposes in the world. Since God is making the world right, He's going to make our lives right, and is inviting us to participate in making the world right, then that encounter with God is critical. And for so many people, they have memory of encounter with God in holy spaces and places. And yet today, we're trying to reach a group of people who don't have that mental model. They don't have that history. And if anything, some of those places that we think of as holy are actually filled with feelings of judgment or trauma or discouragement or hypocrisy or it's so now our spaces and our places we have to actually hold lightly. And so the question we're always asking people, using the Lewis and Clark metaphor, is, if the whole point is it used to be about a water route. That's what Lewis and Clark were trying to find, a water route. Yeah. So they docked. And as soon as they got to the Rocky Mountains and they could no longer paddle, they have to drop the canoes. They came on this because it's a canoe trip, and they had to drop the canoes because the Rocky Mountains were in front of them. The question we got to ask over and over again is this thing we're holding on to a canoe that we actually need to let go of because trying to carry it over this terrain is going to kill us? Or is this something that needs to be reframed? Is it into something important and that we're going to take forward? And those are critical conversations that are about more than just buildings. They're about almost everything that has shaped the past of a community.
We did a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the even the church language that we use. I have it in for the hymn, "There is a fountain filled with blood." Specifically, not because it's theologically bad, but can you imagine a person who's never known church, who, for whatever reason, thanks be to God, stumbled into your door, and they see written on this program that they don't know it's called a bulletin, they see on this program that they've been handed, "There is a fountain filled with blood." I would leave. Or I would wonder whose blood it is, but I would be straight out of there. And so, it is a lot of these folks who theoretically we're here to reach. We're here to reach a world that doesn't necessarily know that they need God, need a church community. And even down, some of it is the structures, but it's so much. You're right. There's so much more than that. To me, it's even down to the song titles. Can we? There is a fountain filled with blood. Again, theologically, that song's fine. It's fine. It even sounds nice. But the idea of a visitor walking in who's never known a church and then finding out that there's a fountain filled with blood, I would run away as fast as I could.
Emily, I'm wondering if you have a similar something that you're aware of.
So we talk a lot about getting out of our God boxes, right? Getting out of our churches, because again, like you were saying, for so many, those places are not a place of solace. They are a place of judgment or of hypocrisy, or of some experience that they had that is not a positive experience. And so I think, flipping the script on that is important. But I think so much of my work as a deacon, so in the United Methodist Church, we have elders and deacons for those who are following along. So as a deacon, our job is to be sort of a bridge, right? To be one foot in the community, one foot in the church. And so taking church to the places and spaces in the margins, to the people. So the places that maybe you don't expect to find church, or you don't expect to find Christian witness in the world, and loving those who may not think that they yet belong to an organization like the church, or that they should not yet belong because they don't fit the mold of what it means to be part of a congregation, part of a church, part of a faith community. And so, yeah, I like sort of working and thinking outside of the box and adapting, and finding new ways to reach people for Christ in non-traditional models. So I've really enjoyed your work in this field of adaptive leadership, as we all have to face changes in the world, changes from pandemics, changes from culture, changes from whatever it is that has come up against your congregation that's led you to a podcast like this, How to Restart a Church. Whatever it is that's brought you here to listen to us for, 30 minutes, an hour a week. I'm excited for the opportunity for people to really dig in and find what it is that is their niche in their community, their way to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I think I really appreciate that, because I think one of the ways to rethink this is, you talked about being a bridge, and oftentimes we think about a bridge from the world to a place. Instead, if you think about, remember, the original understanding of church was a gathering of people. There were no places, right? There were just people who gathered in lots of different places, right? So if you start thinking again, the whole point is, how can we make our community a holy gathering, a holy place? How can we make our relationships and our spaces, and what does that look like? And I'm working with several different of my doctoral students and others who are actually really trying to reframe the whole notion of hospitality as an outward expression of bringing belonging into places where people feel alienated, bringing relationship and unity into spaces and into communities that have been divided by politics and things like that. You start recognizing that much of our tradition has been built on the assumption that we have these cathedrals, and kind of, like I said, that almost every small town, there's a town square, and there's a library and a courthouse, and then the first church of whoever got there first, First Methodist, First Baptist, Presbyterian. And all the other first churches are all on Second Street, because everybody assumed that the world was arranged around law, right? Law. Everything was arranged around law, education, and religion, and it was assumed to Christian religion. Well, if all of a sudden we realize, in the exact same way today, that geography of downtowns has changed, what would it require for us to rethink how we inhabit public spaces as a holy people seeking to?
And I wonder if that's also a reframing of our own metrics of what is discipleship.
Yeah.
Because so often the ministries that you do that are not the traditional model of, well, it's Sunday school, so it's discipleship, or, it's, Wednesday night fellowship group, and so that's a Bible study, so that's discipleship. Rethinking what is discipleship, rethinking what is ministry, because we don't have metrics for that, right? We can't measure that.
So discipleship so I often say that, actually, one of the parts that we know from our research about what happened during the pandemic is, when you talk to leaders, most people would say what it revealed was a crisis of discipleship. We were just not as Christian as we were. And when we asked people to live out the most basic part of Christian faith, how do you love your neighbor? That people just refused to. So we start recognizing that what But what we're dealing with really is a pervasive, I think Emily's entirely right, we have a pervasive crisis of discipleship that needs to be rethought. And what we know is that a lot of the large church, sometimes in the more conservative side of the church, understandings of discipleship were really built around forming people to keep the institutional mechanism of a large church going. Sometimes those are mainline, sometimes those are more conservative. But it's really discipleship became training people to keep the institutional church going. The reaction to that became discipleship as kind of individual self-care. So it became a Bible version of the Calm app or something, right? So instead, what discipleship really is in the very beginning is it's forming people to be able to be with Jesus and reveal Jesus to the world, like participate with what Jesus is doing in the world. Like disciple, I always say that when, I read somebody said, when Jesus called John and James out of the boat, he didn't call them to a 3-year sabbatical, called them to immediately start and be shaped and formed.
For us during the height of the pandemic, and then the somewhat chaotic reopening of the world that we experienced, I think one of the key numbers we could lay our hands on are the people that came back, because not everyone came back. And this is not a unique experience to us, but not everybody came back. The people who did come back were the people who we had actually managed to connect into a feeling of community, whether it was a small group, whether it was a service opportunity, whether it was something. The people who came back were the people who engaged with us online while we were physically apart, but also the people who had those deeper connections to fellow Christians, that this had become something more than a thing you do. This had become a place that they experienced life and community. Those were the folks that returned. And so I think that discipleship crisis really, I think, speaks a lot, not just to how people live their lives, but also even to the degree to which people engage with church. Because church attendance is not necessarily indicative of a deeper connection in to what's really going on.
Yeah. Actually, one of the big pieces, I think the big disruptions about the pandemic was for the better part of the last 30 years, the metric everybody used was worship attendance. So, building bigger buildings and having more services and having more people, having weekends filled with activities was the metric that you use to show vitality. And now that's been waning for years. It just kind of crashed during COVID. And what people need to realize is even larger churches that have big crowds of folks, they don't have people coming very frequently. Before the pandemic, it was considered a regular church attender if you came to worship 1.9 times a month.
Less than twice.
So if you got there less than around twice a month, you're really, really right? Really, really faithful. The over-under is twice a month. Well, for most of our grandparents who went to church every week, who just, would honor the Sabbath by being there, they couldn't even imagine that. Well, today we're in a place where many congregations have got just loosely affiliated groups of people who, if they're in present or they're online or whatever. So now you start asking, is that actually the most transformative metric? And so in our consulting, where we work with churches to figure out how they can make adaptive changes to be really faithful to the mission that they're called to do in their community, one of the last things we have to always do is rework their metrics so that they start thinking, are we actually measuring what matters? And they're different now. There's not one set of metrics that really works across the board for everyone, because it's as diverse as the context you're in.
In what, in the folks you get to work with, in the research you've done, what is your dream for us to all look like in 10 years? Right? If you, obviously your work has borne a lot of fruit, but if your work could grow the biggest fruit, right? What do you hope this all looks like in 10 years? Long enough that we're no longer, we're the pandemic is a distant memory, and hopefully the next one's 90 years in the future. Um, what is, what do you hope this, what do you hope this all looks like?
Well, so 10 years from now, I'll be 70.
Sure.
And I will be
Yeah.
ready to do trout maintenance and
There you go.
I'll be doing trout rescue and trail maintenance
Amen.
and mostly skiing and hiking. So that's what 10 years from now. I always say 10 years from now, if you wrote me and said, "Hey Todd, we've had 10 years of God blessing us ever since you came and worked with us. Please come back." I said, "You're going to have to convince me to come to a celebration that gets me out of a trout stream when we fly fishing." So it better be good. The things that would get me out, the things that I think we'll notice is two things. So to answer your question, 10 years from now, I would like it to be normal that we teach people how to do the kind of adaptive leadership that we do,
Sure.
the
Okay.
way we
Yeah.
teach people how
Uh-huh.
to do good biblical
Yeah.
exegesis. It would be a normal skill in everybody in how. So adaptive leadership is really about how do you faithfully adapt your most precious
Yeah.
values, the things you will not let go of, because to let go of them is to lose something. And lose your identity. Like if you lose this, you lose your identity, your DNA. How do you faithfully adapt your DNA so that you can continually fruitfully live out your mission, and
Yeah.
that will become normal in the church? The people will understand that, and that we'll have a capacity for that. That's where I think in 10 years we could probably get there with enough work we're doing. That's the big one. And the response to that will be lots of different creative experiments in ministry that we will not see the fruit of them for 40 years. People ask me a lot. They'll say, how long do you think we're going to be in this adaptive moment? And my answer is
Forever.
I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure I'm going to die in the wilderness. Right? I'm going to die in the wilderness, and I'm pretty sure you are too. But we're going to develop capacity so that we can be much more fruitful in the future. And so this is adaptive leadership is very long term. It took 1700 years to get through Christendom, and we've been in post Christendom for about 10 minutes. So I think it's probably time. So it's probably really.
No, I appreciate that perspective, right? That we are not trying to ford a small gap and then it all just goes back to normal, right? That there is not for the foreseeable future a normal there, or the normal for the foreseeable future is the abnormal, right? Is the adapting to the situation around us, adapting to a modern world, adapting to to post Christendom, and that is the long-term project. I think that makes a ton of sense, and certainly matches my own lived experience of, the idea that then we're then just going to train. We'll finally get a generation in that we can just train to fit into the little box again. It's just not plausible, right? That's just not the way the world works.
Well, and Trey, you and I do a lot of, you use the phrase, Todd, experimental ministry. And I would say that Trey and I have done some experimental things. A lot of times when we were working in the office together, we'd go, why don't we just try that? Why don't we just try that? That's what we should have needle pointed on a pillow is, what if we just did that? What if we just tried it and see if it works?
Yeah, and what's great about that, Emily, is so what I would want to say is I would want people to be even better experimenters. So here's just one way. So here's one piece of advice for you, since you guys are experimenters.
Yeah.
Get rid of the phrase, "Did it work?" Just get rid of that phrase. Instead, replace that phrase with,
"What did we learn?"
So what did we learn?
Yeah.
Make the experiment a question. What do we want to explore? And then ask, what did we learn?
Yeah.
Because, and learning to do that skill set, to me, that's like, when I talk about like the skill set, when all of us went to seminary and we learned, here's the principles for exegesis. This is how you do good biblical exposition. Here's how you do good interpretation of scripture. There's a set of principles. One of them for experiments are always asking, how might we explore this question that we don't know, that we really don't have an answer to? And then what do we learn from it? And I have this vision in my head that every church that I ever work with will end up with a whiteboard in an office where their goal every year is to
Yeah.
fill the whiteboard with as many learnings as possible. Right? Can you get to, I would say, I have a goal like get to
Yeah.
50 new things you learned this year, one a week.
Yeah.
One a week, and you
Right,
get to take a
which
week
we
off
need.
after Christmas, and a week off after Easter, right? Find 50 things that you learned this year, and then get together and say, because of what we learned this year, we're going to do this next year. We're going to erase that whiteboard, and we're going to fill it again with 50 more things. Like
Yeah.
those who learn the fastest are going to
Yeah.
move the furthest.
That it
Well,
is. Yeah, it is.
and-
It is the never-ending experiment of just, okay, well, we learned this. Not did it work? Just we learned X. Yeah, that's amazing.
I like it.
So
And you
go ahead,
have
Emily.
some
Sorry.
really wonderful new thing. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I had one more question before Emily lets you plug even more amazing work that you've got coming. You talk about resilience, and so, and certainly I've faced this in my own ministry, right? Of, there are seasons where I just feel like I'm banging my head against a wall, right? Where I'm just banging my head against a wall and just praying to God that this next time I hit my head against the wall finally breaks. And so what is your advice for pastors, church leaders that find themselves in that banging their head against a wall place, right? Of how do we keep that, I suspect some of it is a healthy faith life. I know. But like, how do we keep our resilience up? Because this can be just a really emotionally and sometimes even physically draining process.
Yeah. So the book that I wrote on this is called Tempered Resilience. And tempered resilience was built on the metaphor from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, where he says, with this faith, we will be able to hew out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope.
Yeah.
Hew is the verb, hew. And so for most of us, what we think is when we're banging our head against the rock, what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to bash it. We're trying to break it. I said, what do you do when you're facing a mountain of despair? Well, you don't blow it up with dynamite, and you don't bash it with a sledgehammer, and you don't back down. You hew it.
Yeah.
You transform it. Transform despair into hope requires a tempered tool. And a tempered tool is like a chisel. It is both flexible and strong. And tempered resilience is all about the formation needed for leaders when they are facing a mountain of despair. And the most surprising part for most leaders is that formation process starts when you're facing the mountain of despair.
Well, that's
you
good
almost
to know.
can't prepare for it.
That is
You
good to
learn
know.
leadership while you're leading.
That's liberating, actually.
Yeah, it is. Well, I could just put it this way. You became a leader. Yeah, well, you became a leader right after you were good at something that was not leading. Right? Like the reason why most of us became pastors is we were either pretty good preachers. Somebody heard us speak and said, you're good at speaking, so now maybe you'll be good at pastoring or leading, as if 3 points in a poem relate to a people in the same way, right? Or you were good at running a program, organizing people, and they went, okay, you can organize people into a program or whatever. So, okay, we'll make you the pastor of a congregation or a leader of a movement. And you realize, we were good at something that gave us credibility. People trusted us because they saw our competence. Now you actually have to develop the adaptive capacity to actually bring transformation. And that's the key is genuine adaptive challenges require transformation. Leadership is really about taking people through a process of transformation so they can accomplish the mission.
No, but I really find that liberating because I often feel wildly in over my head. And I say this out loud in part because I do not think this is a unique experience. I often feel wildly over my head. It is good to know that in some ways, we all are. That's the point. Is when there was nothing that could have prepared us for this. It is in the process of working through this challenge that we are, God working in us, but that we kind of become the tool that can do this. That is, I deeply appreciate that.
Well, you have some amazing new things coming up, and I cannot wait for them to come out. I'm very excited. Tell us all about what's coming next.
Yeah, so so this summer we're going to be publishing 4 little books, each of them under 100 pages. They'll all be in a series you can buy individually or together, that are all around the 4 biggest mistakes that really good leaders make. And it comes from having coached hundreds and worked with hundreds of churches and leaders through the processes of adaptive change. And what we discovered was our best leaders kept making these mistakes because they were mistakes that came out of their success. And so what we learned is when we're successful and when we've accomplished things and God's used us, we actually do form some patterns or habits that then get in the way when we're trying to lead change. And so there's four little books in the Practicing Change series, and we're beginning to be talking about those, and we'll be teaching and
the first one has a really catchy title, How to Not Waste a Crisis. Quit Trying Harder.
Yeah, how not to waste a crisis. Yeah, the very first thing we noticed is that really, really good leaders, when they're facing a problem, they double down on trying harder. Good leaders are good workers. They're hard-working people. So they work themselves to death in some cases, literally. I mean, but they often work themselves to burnout. And the mistake isn't that you're trying harder. It's that you're trying harder at the old best practices rather than training for new terrain. And so we take people through a process of learning how to go from trying harder.
Yeah, I often, especially with this church, remind myself that works righteousness will not win. Right, that works righteousness is not the answer. I'm a good Wesleyan theologian, and I will tell anyone Wesleyan theology is borderline works righteousness. It's not there, but it's like borderline works righteousness. So we have, I think, a particularly inbuilt desire to find the method, and we just do this thing. And if I just work harder, if I just sink my sanctification or the betterment of this church harder, then I'm finally going to get there. And I've had to, particularly at this one, where it is not a question of I could be here 80 hours a week. That's not the thing that's going to really lead the change. That works righteousness is just my, one of my great sins, is just not the thing that's going to change it.
Well, even for folks who don't think of it in the theological frame, most of us emotionally and psychologically believe that if we just work harder, we can outwork this problem. And there's actually lots and lots of evidence that show that when you're in a system that is in a new terrain, working harder at the old best practices is like paddling harder in a canoe where there isn't any water. I mean, you're just going to burn out your
absolutely.
Road.
Well, Todd, thank you very much. I have
thank you.
Certainly found a lot, both in what you've written, but also in what you shared with us today. And so I am profoundly thankful that you took this 40 minutes to be with us and to share this with others. And other than the books, is there anything else you want to promote before we close out the show?
I just think if folks are interested in getting more help, they can find us at my consulting company. It's AE Sloan Leadership, AESLOAN, AESloanLeadership.com, and find us. You'll find we got lots of good people, we got lots of good coaches, we got lots of good resources, and sometimes we're working with small congregations, and we're working with international denominations. We're doing a strategic plan for a major university, and we're working with coaching pastors, individual leaders, nonprofits. So if we can help, we want to.
And to all of you at home, thank you so much for joining with us in another edition of How to Restart a Church. If you want to share your thoughts on your journey in restarting a church, or the struggles you've had, or the successes you had, right? We can be a space for that. Just email us, thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. That is thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. We would gladly read your thoughts on the air and add even more to this conversation. If you want more of everything that we do here, the Servants Now Media Lab, we're like Servants Now on most of the things. I say everything, that's not true. Most of the things. Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, our website, servantsnow.com. servantsnow.org, youtube.com/servantsnow, where just about everything that we do ends up in one way or another. The show is made possible by a generous Innovators Grant for the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you want to support this work, we could use your help. Like, comment, subscribe, share it with people. Also, 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts actually make a really big difference for podcasts. So head on over there and give us a rating. But also, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. We'll see you next time.